Welcome to Caledonia Sleeps, your peaceful escape into the heart of Scotland. If these stories find you at the end of a long day, I hope they bring you somewhere quieter. A like and a subscribe means more than you know, and I always love hearing where in the world you're listening from tonight. Leave a comment and let me know. And as you do, settle in, let the room soften around you. There is a particular stillness that comes at the end of a long journey, not the stillness of rest exactly, though rest is part of it. It is something deeper than that, the stillness of having arrived somewhere that mattered, of having put your body through something, cold mornings, aching feet, miles of road that seemed to have no end, and come out to the other side, into a place where the ordinary rules of the world felt just for a moment a little thinner. Tonight, we are going to walk the old roads of Scotland together, not the roads of trade or war or necessity, though all of those roads cross the same ground. We are going to follow the pilgrims' path, the road taken by men and women and children who set out from their homes with a staff in hand and a purpose in their heart to reach somewhere sacred, somewhere that promised, if not answers, then at least the rare and precious feeling of having drawn a little closer to something vast and quiet and true. Pilgrimage is one of the oldest human impulses we know of. Long before Christianity arrived in Scotland, long before any saint had given his name to a hill or a well or a stretch of coastline, people were already moving through this landscape with intention, already marking certain places as different from other places, already understanding, in whatever language they had for it, that some ground was holier than other ground. The Christians who came to Scotland in the 4th and 5th centuries were clever about this. They did not always try to erase what was already there. More often, they built on top of it. They found the places that people already gathered at, the springs that were already considered sacred, the islands that were already treated with particular reverence, the hilltops where something had always been felt to be present, and they gave those places new names. They told new stories about them, and the people who had been coming to those places for generations kept coming. This is the quiet thread that runs beneath all of Scottish pilgrimage, the sense that the landscape itself carries memory, that the hills and the lochs and the coastline hold something older than any church, older than any saint, older perhaps than any name we have for it. And then when people walked toward those places with open hearts, they were joining a procession that stretched back further than any of them could see. In Gaelic there is a phrase for it, Cúil a Che, a thin place. It refers to a location where the distance between this world and whatever lies beyond it seems to collapse, where the veil, as people used to say, grows thin enough that you might almost feel what is on the other side. Scotland has always had more than its fair share of thin places. The islands off its western coast, the hilltops that catch the first light, the wells that bubble up cold from deep in the earth, tasting of something ancient and clean. St Columba himself spoke of them, the Irish monk who crossed the sea to Iona in 563 AD and spent the rest of his life on the edge of the world, close to what he loved and what he feared in equal measure. He understood that certain places had a quality that could not be explained, only experienced, only approached on foot with humility. And approaching on foot mattered enormously. The journey was not simply the price you paid for arrival. The journey was part of the point. Medieval Scottish pilgrims were said to be recognisable on the roads of Europe by a distinctive habit. They tied their shoes around their necks and walked barefoot, even over rough ground, even in poor weather, not because they had no choice, but because the hardship was the offering, because it was understood in a way that needed no theology to explain it, that if you arrived having cost yourself nothing, you had perhaps not truly arrived at all. The harder the journey, the more the soul was opened by it. That is the spirit in which we travel tonight. No shoes required, just the fire, the dark, and the old roads of Scotland stretching out ahead of us. Let us begin. We begin our journey in the far southwest of Scotland, in Galloway. It is a softer landscape than the Highlands. Rolling green hills, wide skies, the grey glitter of the Solway Firth in the distance, sheep on the hillsides, hedgerows in flower, a coastline that faces south toward Ireland and the Isle of Man, close enough on a clear day that you might feel you could almost reach across the water. It was across that water that the faith first came. Sometime around 397 AD, the precise date, like so much of what surrounds this story, is debated by scholars and held loosely by tradition. A man named Ninian established a small Christian settlement on a hillside in Galloway. He had been educated in Rome, and the tradition holds that he spent time with St Martin of Tours on his return journey. What he built at Whithorn was simple, a whitewashed stone church surrounded by a few small houses with central hearths. It would have seemed modest, perhaps even humble, against the sweeping landscape around it. But that little white church, the Candida Casa, the White House, would become the beating heart of Scottish Christianity for more than 1,000 years. Ninian was, as far as we can tell from the fragmentary evidence that survives, the first Christian missionary to work north of Hadrian's Wall. The oldest Christian monument in Scotland stands in the Whithorn Museum today, the Latinus stone, a carved slab from the 5th century bearing a Latin inscription. It is a small, worn, imperfect thing, and it is extraordinary. It means that even before the memory of Ninian had passed from living minds into legend, people at Whithorn were marking their faith in stone. By the 7th century, pilgrims were making the journey to Ninian's tomb. We know this because in the 8th century, a monk of the monastery at Whithorn wrote a Latin poem about it, The Miracles of Bishop Ninian, recording the healings and wonders that had occurred at the shrine. People came to Whithorn seeking cures for illness, for comfort in grief, for the particular grace that was said to come from standing close to the bones of a holy man. And they kept coming for over 1,000 years. Picture the approach to Whithorn as a medieval pilgrim would have known it. Many arrived by sea, from Ireland, from the Isle of Man, from Wales and the north of England. Their ships came into the small harbour at the Isle of Whithorn, a few miles south of the town, where a simple chapel stood on a rocky headland above the water. It was a reception chapel built in the 12th century to receive those who had crossed the sea. You stepped off your boat with the salt still on your lips, and the first thing you did was give thanks for arriving safely. Then you walked inland. The path ran northward through the Galloway countryside, a well-worn track lined with the evidence of those who had gone before, worn crossing stones at streams, the remains of wayside chapels, the ruts left by generations of feet. The landscape would have smelled of gorse and sea wind. The sky would have been enormous, and at the end of the road you would have seen the rooftops of Whithorn rising from the hill, the tower of the priory drawing your eye upward. The town that grew up around the shrine was shaped entirely by the needs of those who came to it. Inns and hostelries offered shelter. Cobblers repaired shoes worn out on the long roads. Blacksmiths shod horses and mended carts. There were souvenir sellers and food stalls. The whole busy, imperfect, human commerce of faith made visible in stone and trade. The great and the humble came alike. In 1329, Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, Victor of Bannockburn, the man who had secured Scotland's independence from England, made the journey to Whithorn. He was gravely ill, the sickness that would kill him, and already deep in his body, and the journey must have been agonizing. He came 3 months before his death, seeking a cure that the shrine could not in the end provide. But he came, the king who had held Scotland through decades of war, who had crossed every kind of difficult ground in his long life, put himself on the road to Whithorn, because there was nowhere left to go. His son David II came later, after the Battle of Neville's Cross in 1346, left 2 arrowheads lodged in his body. Tradition holds that one of them resisted every attempt at extraction until David visited the shrine. Whether the arrowhead was removed by faith or by a skilled Galloway surgeon with good timing, the story endured. But of all the royal pilgrims who walked to Whithorn, none came as devotedly, as repeatedly, or as personally as James IV. James was one of Scotland's most remarkable kings, brilliant, contradictory, genuinely loved by his people in a way that few rulers manage. He spoke multiple languages. He was interested in medicine and surgery. He was charming and impulsive in equal measure, and he carried every single day of his adult life a weight of guilt that no amount of kingship could lift. When James was 15 years old, his father James III was killed after the Battle of Sauchieburn in 1488. The young James had not struck the blow himself, but he had taken part in the rebellion that led to it. His father died because of him, and he never forgot it. He is said to have worn an iron chain belt against his bare skin as a penance, adding a new link to it every year, or so tradition holds, and he walked to Whithorn. He walked to Whithorn at least 15 times that we know of, perhaps more. He began the journeys in the early 1490s, when he was barely out of his teens, and he continued every year until the Battle of Flodden in 1513 took his life. He is recorded approaching Whithorn at daybreak, barefoot on foot, while his courtiers and attendants waited behind him. The great king, alone on the road in the early morning light, his feet bare on the cold ground, moving toward the shrine of a saint who had been dead for 1,000 years. When his Queen Margaret fell dangerously ill after the birth of their first child, James walked to Whithorn, barefoot, to pray for her recovery. She recovered. Margaret herself came the following year to give thanks. There is something deeply human in this, something that no amount of power or crown could touch. He was a man who had done something he could not undo, and he spent his life walking toward the one place where he felt he might, perhaps, be forgiven. In July 1504, on one of his journeys south, James encountered a group of ordinary pilgrims on the road, described in the royal treasurer's account as poor folk from Tain, making their way to Whithorn. Tain was in Easter Ross, in the Northern Highlands. These people had walked, or were walking, hundreds of miles across the length of Scotland to reach a second shrine, when they already had a perfectly revered one at home. They had their own saint in Tain, their own miracles, their own holy place, and still that wasn't enough. Still the road called them south. James gave them alms. The treasurer noted it carefully. 2 groups of pilgrims on the same road, heading for the same shrine, separated by everything, crown and poverty, south and north, palace and croft, and joined by exactly the same impulse. We leave Galloway now and travel north and west, following the coastline as it breaks into islands, until we reach the innermost edge of the Inner Hebrides. Here, off the southwestern tip of the Isle of Mull, lies a small island, barely 3 miles long. You can cross it in an hour on foot. On a clear day, you can see the paps of Jura to the south and the distant mountains of Ireland to the west. This is Iona. It is difficult to describe what Iona feels like to those who have not been there. The light is different. Even on grey days, there is a quality to the air and the water that is hard to account for. The sea around the island runs in extraordinary colours, pale turquoise near the white sand beaches, deepening to cobalt in the sound between Iona and Mull. The island is low and quiet. The wind comes off the Atlantic without anything to slow it down. Columba arrived here in 563 AD with 12 companions. He had come from Ireland, not as a missionary in the first instance, but as something closer to an exile. He was a man of royal blood, a powerful and learned monk, and he had been at the centre of a dispute in Ireland over the copying of a manuscript that had somehow escalated into a battle in which hundreds of men died. Whether or not Columba bore direct responsibility, the weight of it followed him. He crossed the sea as an act of penance, an exile from the land he loved, and founded a monastery on the edge of the known world. Tradition holds that when he first landed on Iona, he climbed to a high point on the island and looked south. He could still see Ireland across the water, and so he moved further north, to a point from which the green hills of his homeland were no longer visible. Only then did he feel he could stay. He spent 34 years on Iona. He never went back to Ireland. The monastery he built was simple: wooden buildings, thatched roofs, the rhythm of prayer and labour and study that shaped all early Celtic monasteries. But word spread quickly. Iona became a centre of learning and scholarship, of remarkable intensity. It was here, most historians now believe, that the Book of Kells was created, that extraordinary illuminated manuscript, with its spiralling knotwork and its creatures peering out from the margins of the Gospels, now housed in Trinity College, Dublin. Made on this small island in the Atlantic by monks with cold fingers and extraordinary vision, and Iona became a place of burial for kings. At Raleigh Oran, the graveyard beside the old chapel, named for Columba's companion Oran, the dead were brought from across Scotland and beyond. 48 Scottish kings are said to be buried there, along with Irish and Norwegian kings, including, according to medieval sources, Macbeth himself, the real Macbeth, not Shakespeare's invention, a king who ruled Scotland for 17 years and was considered in his own time a good one. They were brought to Iona because it was understood, without much needing to be said, that to be buried here was to be buried in the most sacred ground in Scotland, close to the thin place, close to whatever waited on the other side. The Vikings came too. In 795 AD, the first raid fell on Iona, then again in 802, burning the monastery, again in 806, when 68 members of the community were killed on the beach at what is now called Martyrs Bay, again in 825. The monks who survived carried what they could, including, it seems, the unfinished Book of Kells, to Ireland for safekeeping. But they came back, the monastery was rebuilt, the island endured. Pilgrims made the journey to Iona throughout the medieval period, crossing the Sound from Mull in small boats, arriving on the white sand beaches with the particular feeling of the sea crossing still in their bodies. The island had specific places of devotion. St Columba's Bay, at the southern end of the island, where the saint is said to have first landed. Pilgrims carried a white stone from Ireland and left it on the beach, a small gesture of connection between the two shores that Columba had spent his life trying to hold together. A stone carried across the water, set down in the place where the journey ended. On the summit of Dún E, the island's highest point, there is a natural basin in the granite rock. It is called Tober Nahisha, the well of eternal youth, sometimes the well of age, sometimes the pool of healing. The water collects there in all weathers, cold and clear, and in Celtic tradition, the well was understood as a portal to the other world, to the land of eternal youth that lay just beyond the world we can see. Pilgrims climbed the hill to wash their faces in it. Some say they still do. Columba himself gave the island its name as a thin place. He spoke and wrote of the quality of certain locations, places where the distance between this world and whatever sacred thing lay beyond it had grown so slight that you might almost reach through. He didn't invent the concept. It existed in the older Gaelic understanding of the landscape, in the belief that the world we walk through is not the only world, and that some ground is closer to the others than ordinary ground. But Iona, in the centuries after his death, became the word's truest home. Pilgrims did not only come seeking miracles, though they sought those too. They came simply to stand in a place where the distance felt smaller, to breathe the air of it, to carry something of it home with them, in their bodies and their memory, for the long journey back. Now we move east across Scotland, from the Atlantic coast to the North Sea, to the grey stone town of St Andrews in Fife. The story of how this particular place became one of the great pilgrimage destinations of medieval Europe is strange and winding, as the best stories tend to be. It begins not in Scotland at all, but in the ancient world of the Eastern Mediterranean. with a fisherman from the Sea of Galilee. Andrew was the brother of Simon Peter. He was, according to the Gospels, one of the first disciples called by Jesus as he walked beside the water. He is described as bringing his brother to meet this man who had changed his life. He was present at the Last Supper, in the Garden of Gethsemane, at the resurrection. After the crucifixion, tradition holds that he travelled as a missionary as far as Greece and what is now Turkey. He was martyred in Patras in Greece, crucified on a diagonal cross, the X shape we still call the saltire, around 60 AD. He never came anywhere near Scotland in his lifetime. He was a man of the ancient Middle East, utterly remote in time and geography from the windswept Fife coast. And yet, in 732 AD, a bishop called Acca of Hexham, fleeing political turmoil in Northumbria, sought asylum with the Pictish king Angus of the Picts in Fife. He brought with him, according to tradition, a collection of relics, among them bones of the Apostle Andrew himself, 3 fingers, an upper arm bone, a kneecap, a tooth. These were housed at a place called Kilrymont, a name that means something like Headland of the King's Mount on the Fife coast, and from that moment the story of that place changed entirely. By the 11th century, the numbers of pilgrims travelling to Kilrymont to venerate the Apostles' relics had grown so large that Queen Margaret of Scotland, a remarkable woman, later canonised herself, established a free ferry service across the Firth of Forth to ease their crossing. She set up hostels at North and South Queensferry on either bank of the Firth to house the pilgrims who arrived in all weathers and at all hours. The town around the shrine was renamed. It became St Andrews. The cathedral, begun in 1158, would eventually be, when completed in 1318, the largest church ever built in Scotland, 119 metres long, with towers you could see from miles out to sea and from the hills to the west. It was consecrated in the presence of Robert the Bruce, who, according to legend, rode his horse up the Isle. The town's very street plan was laid out around the needs of the pilgrims, the broad sweep of North Street and South Street, designed for the procession that wound its way to the shrine and back, with Market Street running between them, to provide the food and trade and human noise that always gathered wherever people gathered. Imagine arriving here after weeks on the road. You have crossed the Firth of Forth on the Queen's Ferry. You have walked the final miles through Fife, with the smell of the sea growing stronger and the tower of St Rule's Church rising ahead of you, built tall, specifically to be a guiding landmark, visible from the countryside for miles around. You pass through the town gates and into the noise and colour of the place, the market stalls, the other pilgrims, the smell of bread and tallow candles, and incense drifting from the cathedral doors. You enter through the north door, and the candlelight takes you. After the grey road and the grey sky, and the cold and the miles, there is gold everywhere. Wall hangings, statues, tomb effigies, the deep amber smell of incense, and ahead of you, at the far end of the building, the shrine itself, the reliquary containing what was said to be the physical remains of a man who had walked with Christ. Whatever you believe, whatever the truth of the bones and the relics and the miracles attributed to them, there is no doubting the power of that arrival. The weeks of road distilled into a single moment of arrival in a blaze of light and gold. On the 14th of June, 1559, a crowd inflamed by the preaching of John Knox tore through St Andrews Cathedral and destroyed it. The shrine was smashed. The relics were scattered or lost. Within a generation, the greatest pilgrimage church in Scotland was a ruin. The magnificent hollow walls that still stand today, the grass growing where the nave once rang, with the footsteps of the faithful. We travel north now, a long way north, past Inverness and across the Black Isle and along the Firth of Cromarty into Easter Ross, to a small royal borough called Tain. Tain is Scotland's oldest royal borough, chartered in 1066. It sits on the southern shore of the Dornoch Firth, looking across the water to the hills of Sutherland. It is a quiet place now, a little removed from the main roads of the Highlands. But in the medieval period, Tain was one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in all of Scotland, more visited in the century before the Reformation than St Andrews, than Iona, than anywhere else in the country. The saint at the centre of it was called Duthic. He was born in Tain around the year 1000, educated in Ireland and died there. Early Scottish saints, it has been observed, tended to manage these things the other way around. He was a bishop, and the stories told about him speak of a man of unusual gentleness. He was remembered above all for his devotion to hearing confession, for the patience and the care he brought to giving spiritual counsel. People trusted him with their worst and most private selves. In a world where confession was both religious obligation and genuine psychological release, Duthic seems to have been particularly good at offering something that felt like genuine absolution. There is a story told of him in childhood. He is said to have gathered red-hot coals in his apron and carried them home to his mother, unburned. The miracle of the coals, fire held without harm, became his signature image, the detail that attached itself to his name and made him recognisable across the Highlands and beyond. In 1253, nearly 2 centuries after his death, Duthac's body was brought home to Tain. The remains, when examined, were said to be incorrupt, not decayed, as a body kept for 200 years in the ground should have been, but preserved, intact, a sure sign in the understanding of the time of holiness. An incorrupt body meant the saint was still present in it, still close, still reachable. The chapel built on the site of his birth became immediately a place of pilgrimage, and it became immediately a place of sanctuary, a place where even the law's reach was limited, where those in danger could come and be safe. The sanctuary was violated almost at once, and in a way that left a mark on Scottish history. In 1307, Robert the Bruce was in the desperate years of his war against English occupation. He was a fugitive king, on the run, and he sent his wife Elizabeth, his daughter Marjorie, and his female relatives ahead of him toward the relative safety of Orkney. They took shelter in the sanctuary chapel at Tain. They believed themselves safe there, protected by the ancient laws of holy ground. The Earl of Ross took them prisoner regardless, breaking the sanctuary. He handed them to the English. They were imprisoned for years. Bruce's daughter Marjorie was sent to a nunnery under harsh conditions. His wife endured years of captivity. The Earl of Ross, safe on his own lands, apparently suffered no immediate divine retribution for what he had done, but history remembered. The sanctuary chapel came to its own strange end in 1427, when a local outlaw, pursuing an enemy who had taken refuge inside it, burned the building down, solving the problem of sanctuary by eliminating the sacrifice space itself. The relics of St Duthok were moved to the Collegiate Church in the centre of Tain, which had been built to house them in greater splendour. It was in this church that James IV found his second great place of pilgrimage. If Whithorn was where James went to do penance, Tain was where he went to maintain the relationship. He made at least 18 documented pilgrimages to the shrine of St Duthok between 1493 and 1513, visiting once or sometimes twice a year. The royal treasurer's accounts record his gifts to the shrine in careful detail. A gold reliquary in 1496, a cross in a silver case in 1497, a unicorn, the royal symbol of Scotland, wrought in precious metal in 1498. He spent the night in Tain, talked to the canons, prayed at the shrine, and moved on. Year after year, a ritual as regular and as necessary as the turning of the seasons. In 1492, Pope Innocent VIII issued a papal bull confirming the Collegiate Church's special status. That document still survives in the church today, and when the Reformation came and the relics of Duthok were lost in 1561, something extraordinary happened. The people of Tain refused to tear down the statue of their saint. On the west front of St Duthok's church, A carved stone figure of the saint survived the Reformation intact, not hidden, not buried, simply left in place, because the people of the town would not allow it to be destroyed. It is still there, still standing on the outside of the church, where it has stood for centuries, weather-worn and quietly insistent, in the heart of what became one of the staunchest Protestant towns in the Highlands. Some things are harder to let go of than theology. There is a loch in Wester Ross called Loch Maree. It runs for 12 miles through some of the most dramatic scenery in the Scottish Highlands. Slioch rising to the north like a great stone wall, ancient Caledonian pine woods reflected in the dark water, the mountains pressing close on every side. More than 20 small islands are scattered across the loch's surface, most of them thickly wooded. One of them is different. Isle Maree sits near the centre of the loch. It is small, barely large enough to hold a ruined chapel, a handful of ancient gravestones, and a remarkable collection of trees, quite unlike the Scots pine that dominates every other island in the loch. On Isle Maree, there are ancient oaks, holly trees, a quiet that feels different from the quiet of the surrounding hills. The island takes its name from St Andrews, an Irish monk who founded the monastery of Applecross on the nearby coast around 671 AD. He chose Isle Maree as a place of retreat, a hermitage, removed from even the modest community of the monastery, where he could be alone with God and with whatever else the island held, because the island held something already. The choice of Isle Maree was not random. An ancient stone circle has been found on the island, dated to around 100 BC. The unique selection of trees, oaks and hollies, where every neighbouring island grows only pine, speaks of deliberate planting, of human attention paid to this place over centuries before Christianity arrived. The island sat in liminal ground, the place where land meets water, where the known world gives way to something less certain. In pre-Christian Scotland, as in many cultures, such places were understood to belong to the powers that moved beneath the surface of the ordinary world. Thomas Pennant, the naturalist and traveller who visited in the 18th century, looked at the stone circle and the ancient well and was direct about what he saw. He wrote that he expected the ritual enclosure there to have originally been druidical, and that the ancient superstition of paganism had been taken up by the saint as the readiest method of making a conquest over the minds of the inhabitants. The saint stepped into the space the old gods had vacated, and for a while the arrangement held. The well on Isle Maree was said to have a particular virtue. It could cure lunacy. People from across the Northwest Highlands and further came to the island seeking healing for family members who had lost their minds to illness. The ritual was specific and demanding. The patient was brought to the island by boat. The boat circled the island 3 times sunwise, following the path of the sun, the ancient orientation that predated any saint. As the boat rounded the island on each circuit, the sick person, with a rope tied around them, was lowered into the cold water of the loch and pulled up again. 3 immersions, 3 circles, 3 chances for whatever the island held to work its cure. Then the patient drank from the holy well, and a coin was pressed into the bark of the ancient oak tree beside it as an offering, not to the saint exactly, but to something, to the place itself, to the deep, unnamed power that had been there before Malruva arrived, and that would, it seemed, be there long after. These practices continued into the 18th century. They were not secret. They were not shameful. They were simply what you did when someone you loved had lost their mind and medicine had failed them, when the world had run out of ordinary remedies and you were left with only the extraordinary ones. But in the 17th century, the practices took a form that alarmed the church considerably more than well visiting. The records of the Presbytery of Dingwall, the Church of Scotland court for that region, contain a series of deeply uncomfortable entries. In 1678, 4 men were called before the presbytery and disciplined for sacrificing a bull on Isle Maree on the feast day of Malruva, the 25th of August. The sacrifice involves slaughtering the animal on the island and roasting it there, in what the presbytery was in no doubt was a continuation of a pagan ritual far older than Christianity. In 1695, a man named Hector Mackenzie and his family were brought before the same court, accused of the same offence, sacrificing a bull on the island in the hope of curing a sick relative. The entity being appeased or petitioned in these rituals was not, as far as the presbytery could determine, St Malruva. The name that appeared in the records was older and stranger, God Maori, a deity whose name had persisted in the folk memory of the people around Loch Maree long after the Christian monk, whose name superficially resembled it, had been dead for 1,000 years. The two had become confused or intertwined in oral tradition, the saint and the old god, until it was impossible to say with confidence where one ended and the other began. The presbytery was unable to suppress it. The cult, as they called it, was too deeply embedded. People came far beyond the Gairloch region. The records note visitors from what they described as foreign countries. The island drew them. The practices continued. Isle Maree today is quiet. The well is gone, dried up or lost. The ancient oak that stood beside it was killed by copper poisoning from the coins that generations of visitors pressed into its bark. The weight of human hope, literally too much for the tree to bear. A new tree grows in its place, and people press coins into that one too. The oral tradition about the island persists in the communities around Loch Maree. Nothing must ever be taken from the island, not a stone, not a twig, not a pebble from the water's edge. The old stories say that anyone who takes something will carry with them all the way home the insanity that the island once cured. The madness follows the thief. Whether or not you believe this, the instruction has a certain wisdom in it. Leave the sacred things where they are. Some places are not ours to take from. In 1581, the Scottish Parliament passed an act that made pilgrimage illegal. The language of the act was sharp and clear. It spoke of a perverse inclination to superstition, through which the dregs of idolatry yet remained in divers parts of the realm through the using of pilgrimage to chapels, wells, crosses, and such other monuments of idolatry. It prohibited all of it, the journeys to shrines, the visits to holy wells, the bonfires and carols on saints' days, the whole living fabric of folk devotion that had grown up over 1,000 years of Scottish Christianity. The shrines fell in the same movement. John Knox's followers had torn through St Andrews Cathedral in June 1559, smashing the shrine and scattering the relics of the apostle. The shrine at Whithorn had gone quiet and dark. The relics of St Duthic at Tain were lost in 1561. Iona's monastic life had effectively ended with the Reformation. 1,000 years of sacred geography was deliberately and systematically dismantled in a generation. What strikes me, looking back at all of it, is not how completely it was destroyed. It is how much persisted. In 1628, the Kirk Session of Falkirk ordered several people who had made a pilgrimage to a local holy well to appear in church on 3 appointed Sundays, dressed in the garb of penitents, public shaming, in front of the whole congregation, as punishment for visiting a spring with a prayer in their hearts. The Kirk Session would not have bothered with this if the visits had stopped. In 1629, the Privy Council of Scotland issued an order commissioning investigators to search at all parts and places where this idolatrous superstition is used, and to take and apprehend all persons, of whatever rank and quality, who were found going to chapels or wells. Rank and quality, even the wealthy, even the well-connected, were still going. In Moray, at a well dedicated to St Mary, near the village of Orton, people were still making the journey barefoot from as far away as the Hebrides, well into the post-Reformation period, seeking cures for ailments of the eyes and joints. Church authorities in Elgin took action against well visitors in 1584, just a generation after the Reformation. They took action again and again because people kept going. When St Querin's Well at Trochweir in Dumfries and Galloway was cleared out in 1870, workers found hundreds of objects at the bottom: pins, coins, small offerings pressed into the mud of the well over the centuries. These were not left before the Reformation. They were left after it, quietly, carefully, by people who knew perfectly well that what they were doing was officially prohibited, and who did it anyway. This is the thing about sacred geography. You can ban the pilgrimage, you can pull down the shrine, you can prosecute the well visitor and dress them in penitent's white before the whole parish, but you cannot make a place unsacred to the people who have known it as sacred all their lives. You cannot make the water taste ordinary again. You cannot make the hill look like just a hill. The impulse that sent people to these places, the need to put their bodies in motion towards something that mattered, to make a physical journey that matched the interior one, to arrive somewhere and feel the world grow briefly thin. That impulse did not die with the Reformation. It went underground. It persisted in small gestures, in private visits, in the coins left under cover of darkness, and the cloth strips tied to the trees at the old wells when no one was watching. It was waiting, as these things tend to be, for the world to be ready to let it breathe again. In 2017, the Whithorn Trust established a new walking route from Glasgow to Whithorn, 155 miles, following much of the medieval pilgrim road south through Ayrshire and Galloway to the cradle of Scottish Christianity. They called it the Whithorn Way. People walk it still, collecting passport stamps at waypoints along the route, arriving at the priory ruins where Robert the Bruce knelt and James IV walked barefoot at dawn. There is a route that follows Columba's journey from Iona to St Andrews through the heart of Scotland, past Loch Lyon and the Silvery Tay, along the long golden beaches of the Fife coast. The Northern Pilgrim's Way runs from Tain north to Kirkwall in Orkney, following paths that medieval pilgrims walked between the shrine of St Duthac and the Cathedral of St Magnus. The Scottish Pilgrim Routes Forum now maintains and promotes a network of routes across the country, each one following ground that was walked for faith long before anyone thought to waymark it. And Iona receives its pilgrims still. The island takes no cars. You cross from Mull by ferry, arriving as people have always arrived, across the water, with the crossing in your body. The Iona community, which has lived on the island year-round since its founding in 1938, carries the tradition of hospitality and prayer forward into the present. Pilgrims wash their faces in the well of eternal youth on the summit of Dún Í. They carry their stones to Columbus Bay. They stand in the Abbey Church in the late afternoon light and feel whatever it is that this place has always made people feel. What draws people to these roads now is not, for most of them, the same thing that drew a medieval pilgrim. They are not coming to venerate the bones of an apostle, or to seek a cure at a saint's shrine, or to perform a penance for a sin that weighs on them like iron. Most of them are not even practicing Christians, and yet they come in greater numbers each decade, walking the same ground, following the same skylines, arriving at the same places with the same feeling, worn out and present, and strangely open in a way that ordinary life rarely provides. Perhaps what it comes down to is this: we still understand in some part of ourselves that is older than any theology that the body knows things the mind does not, that to put yourself on the road towards something, to give your feet to a path and your legs to the hours and your attention to the ground beneath you, is to arrive somewhere interior as well as somewhere geographical. That arriving costs something, that things which cost something are worth more than the things which don't. The Cailleach shaped these hills. The Sidhe moved in the green mounds beside these roads. The waters that fed these wells rose from deeper in the earth than any saint could claim. Scotland was sacred before it had words for it, before any missionary stepped off a boat on any shore, before any church was built or any sermon preached. The pilgrims who walked these roads knew this, even when they knelt before a Christian shrine at the end of their journey. They could feel it in the ground, in the cold water of the holy wells, in the particular silence of the islands like Iona and Isle Maree, a silence that is not empty, but full of something that does not have a name, but that every person who has stood in those places has felt. The road is still there. The thin places have not moved. And somewhere ahead of you, if you listen, you can hear the sound of feet on stone, generations of them, countless of them, all moving in the same direction. Rest now. Let the fire keep you warm, and let the old roads of Scotland carry you gently into sleep. You don't have to walk tonight. You only have to arrive. And if you have found comfort or wonder or a little peace in these stories tonight, I would be so glad if you would share them. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let the sacred roads of Scotland walk with you through whatever lies ahead. Good night from Scotland. Good night from the fireside. good night.